I'm only telling you this because I still wake up tasting metal. I woke up strapped into the pilot seat of a freezing escape pod. Red strobes cutting the dark while the whole capsule rolled end over end. My first breath was a gasp that didn't feel like it filled my lungs. The cracked display in front of me flashed oxygen critical, and the hull kept answering with a slow, rhythmic banging, like something outside was matching my heartbeat on the biomonitor. This is my testimony, and this is where I tell you what happened, exactly the way it happened. I didn't have the luxury of panic for more than a few seconds. Panic burns oxygen you don't have. I fumbled the restraints open with hands that didn't feel like my own. The pod was so small that when I pushed off the wall, I drifted too far and smacked my shoulder on the opposite bulkhead. Pens and water droplets floated around me like the cabin had been shaken upside down. Every time the red strobes flashed, those droplets lit up like tiny warning lights. I wiped condensation off the cracked display with my glove until I could read it clearly. Oxygen critical. Not low. Not decreasing. Critical. I remember thinking, very calmly, this can't be happening. I'm a bioengineer. I know exactly what critical means. It means you don't get a second chance to be wrong. The pod was still tumbling, slow and nauseating, like being trapped inside a clothes dryer. I found the manual override lever half hidden behind a hanging bundle of wires that were sparking in the dark. I braced my boots against the floor grating and hauled on the lever until my ribs screamed. Something finally gave with a metal clink, and the motion smoothed out. The groaning in the hull dropped to a steady whir like a tired animal settling down. For one breath, I felt relief. Then I saw my own breath cloud in front of my face. The thermal regulators were gone. The cabin wasn't just cold. It was actively dying. The kind of cold that makes metal feel wet and makes your joints ache like they're being filled with sand. I popped open an access panel and tried to rewire what I could. I'd done field repairs before, clean, well-lit repairs with time and tools. This was me twisting raw copper with trembling fingers while a live arc snapped inches from my knuckles. Every time it zapped, I flinched so hard my teeth clicked. I kept telling myself it was just a power surge. Just a loose connection. Just one more thing I could fix. When the interior lights flickered and went out completely, the silence that replaced them felt heavier than the pod itself. For a full second, there was nothing, no hum, no fan, no alarm. Just the sound of my own swallow and the faint, endless pressure of space outside. Backup power kicked on with a sickly green glow. I drifted to the survival kit and tore through it like it had insulted me. Rations, a foil blanket that felt like an apology, a flare, a flashlight. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it into the cargo crawl space. Mostly to prove to myself that there was nothing in there. The beam caught something on the floor. A viscous smear. Too thick to be condensation. It clung to the metal like it had intent. It didn't belong in an escape pod. I stared at it long enough for my brain to start offering explanations I didn't believe. Coolant leak. Chemical spill. Somebody else's mass. Anything that meant it wasn't what it looked like. A low thud rolled through the hull. Distant, but real enough to vibrate the floor plates. Then another. Then another, rhythmic, steady, like someone knocking politely on a door that shouldn't exist. My chest piece, the little blinking biomonitor bolted to my flight suit, picked that moment to spike. The green line jumped like it had been slapped. The beeping sped up until it sounded less like a machine and more like an accusation. I put my ear against the wall and listened, because that's what you do when you're alone and your brain needs the threat to make sense. The banging wasn't random. It had spacing. It had a pattern. For a terrifying second, I caught myself wondering if it was communication. And I hated myself for thinking that, because the alternative was worse, that it was just debris hitting the hull. And I was assigning it meaning because my oxygen-starved brain needed a story. I crawled to the life support scrubbers. Started scraping carbon buildup off the filter like I could bully clean air out of it. My breathing sounded loud, wet at the back of my throat. The CO2 alarm chirped in tight, sharp bursts that made my skin crawl. I kept working until my hands cramped. When I paused, the pod seemed to pause with me. That's when I noticed the airlock wheel. It had shifted just a fraction. The kind of movement you can convince yourself you imagined, unless you stare long enough and watch the shadow under it change. I grabbed a heavy wrench and held it like it was going to make me braver. The lighting shifted to a yellow alert pulse, and every time it flashed, the shadows behind the pipes looked like hands reaching. I scanned the corners, and my vision started to blur at the edges. The instrument panels melted into neon smears. The world felt underwater. Hypoxia. CO2 buildup. My body was turning my fear into symptoms, and the symptoms were feeding the fear. I slapped my own cheeks hard enough to sting, just to force focus back into my skull. The carbon dioxide alarm was screaming at me now. I ripped up a floor panel to get to the reserve oxygen tank. The panel came loose with an ugly screech, and I leaned into the hole like a drowning person reaching for a pocket of air. The reserve gauge sat there, stupid and unmoving, the needle pinned on 0. I tapped it once. Twice. Then I saw my own face reflected in the glass, eyes too wide, mouth slightly open, and I understood what it meant. I smashed the gauge with a wrench. Glass flew in slow, lazy arcs in the thin air. Something hissed, but it wasn't oxygen. It was the last of a lie escaping. I fell back into the pilot's seat. The displays glitched and flipped, some of them upside down, numbers contradicting each other like the pod's computer couldn't decide if I was alive or already gone. In that moment, I wasn't sure either. The banging came back, louder, closer, shaking the cabin. Only this time, I didn't flinch the same way. I listened. I tilted my head like an idiot, like a person trying to catch a melody through static. The pattern felt familiar, and that scared me more than the sound itself. I pressed my ear to the hull. I could feel the resonance through my teeth. Rivets popped somewhere down the line, tiny metallic snaps that made my stomach drop. Then the wall dented inward. Not a small buckle. A deliberate impression, as if something on the outside had pressed a palm into thick metal and decided to push. Paint flaked off in slow motion. The shape was wrong. Too much like fingers. I scrambled backward over the seats, knocking a crate of supplies loose. Packages burst open and floated, drifting between me and the dent like a pathetic little barricade. The pod smelled like ozone and cold sweat. The lights died again. Pitch black. No strobes. No panels. The only light was the green pulse from my chest monitor, painting my face from below like I was telling ghost stories to myself. My breath sounded huge in the darkness, and the banging stopped so suddenly my ears rang with the absence. I struck a red emergency flare. The light came up harsh and chemical. And it showed me something that made my stomach turn, a thin mist hanging in the air. Drifting in ribbons like the pod was exhaling. I moved through it slowly, flare in one hand, wrench in the other. The red smoke curled around the pipes and the seat frames, turning everything into a bad dream. I rebooted the CO2 scrubber interface on muscle memory, fingers flying even as they asked. The screen flickered, stuttered, then confirmed the command. Fans kicked in. I started coughing so hard my knees buckled. The air rushing past didn't feel clean, it felt stirred up. When I wiped my mouth, my glove came away black with soot, and threaded through it, dark blood. That's when I heard scratching near the airlock. A sound like claws on metal. Not banging anymore. Not pattern. Scratching, right where the door seal met the frame. I stepped toward the airlock window, flare light pulsing, and I saw myself reflected back. Only the reflection was smiling. It was subtle at first, like the corners of my mouth had lifted without permission. I blinked hard, and it was gone, just my own terrified face again. I rubbed my temples, trying to press the hallucination out through my skin. The gravity generator chose that moment to fluctuate. My stomach lifted. My boots left the floor. Water from a leaking pipe formed floating globules around me, and a second it almost looked beautiful, little liquid stars spinning in the flare light, until I remembered I was trapped in a dying box. I grabbed overhead piping and pulled myself along the ceiling toward the main breaker box. The perspective made the floor look like it was above me. When I opened the breaker panel, melted fuses stared back like burned teeth. Sparks drifted past my face in slow arcs. I pulled a spare fuse from my pocket and watched it slip from my glove, floating away like the universe was mocking me. I lunged, caught it, shoved it in. Gravity slammed back on. I hit the deck so hard my vision flashed white. Dust and loose equipment rained down. I lay there, clutching my ribs, and when I looked up, the lights were steady, bright, clean white. And in that bright light, I saw the walls. Graffiti scratched into the metal. Deep, frantic gouges. Don't open. It's in the blood. I didn't remember writing any of it. But when I touched the fresh scratches, I looked down at my fingernails, broken, bloody, raw, and I knew, in a way that made me feel hollow, that the warnings were mine. The moment I recognized my own handwriting carved into steel, the pod felt less like a lifeboat and more like a quarantine cell ID built for myself. Everything sped up after that. The banging came back harder, metal tearing somewhere out of sight. I found the cryo canister strapped to the co-pilot seat and wiped the frost off the viewport with my thumb, already praying for anything that explained the slime. It was empty. Not used. Empty like it had never held what it was meant to hold. Then the ship's AI finally spoke, distorted. Two words with the red strobes sinking to it. Quarantine breach. I used a shot of mirror to check my neck. Saw a rash climbing my jugular, faintly glowing like that residue on the floor. I tried to scrape it off until I bled, because denial can turn you into your own predator. A rescue ship crossed my window later. I screamed Mayday into a dead mic and watched it pass without even turning. So I fixed the engine. I bypassed the safety regulator. I ran the debris field. When the side window cracked, I sealed up with expanding foam with second to their left. If you want the rest of what happened, and what that infection actually does, subscribe to follow this testimony. My opinion, looking back, the lesson isn't be brave. It's don't negotiate with evidence. If something is wrong, treat it as real early, because late is when it gets into your blood.